Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I know more people are joining us, but I think we should start on time. May I kindly ask you to please turn your cameras on? We are a few people, so it would be nice to actually see a bit more faces than black boxes. So it's really, really great to see you in this first workshop of the chapter on migration. And we're really happy to have with us back Lucienne van der Walt from Rhodes University in South Africa. Thanks again, Lucienne, for joining us.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, there's been quite a bit of interest and responses to your video lecture on the ICU, a very, very interesting case study. And I want to pick up to in relation to one of the questions you made at the very end, and that people's responses, our activist responses to those questions, which has been that, the question was, given the power of ethnic, national, and racial identities, is one big union feasible today? What do you think and why? And many have referred to actually global unions today as an example of such possibility. So let's start with that. Is ICU kind of something similar to the global unions today? What are similarities and differences of the ICU when you compare it to the global unions?
Look, I think it's hi everyone. I think it's different in a very basic way, which is that a lot of the global union federations bring together unions in specific sectors in different countries. So they're federations that draw on nationally structured union movements. I think, secondly, they're often very bureaucratized. Now, I stand to be corrected, but they're at a very they're pretty distant from a lot of the basic union memberships. I mean, this is often mediated through representatives at the top level of union federations or of sectoral unions who then participate in these structures. So ordinary workers are not really involved in them that much. I mean, they're incredibly distant from most workers. And I suspect even in a country where you've got quite effective trade unions, a lot of people would be unaware of what the GUFs and the GUFs and other international bodies do. They would not see much practical effect in their day-to-day organizing. And more importantly, I don't think it would be part of the consciousness of people that we're in this international structure. So I think it's that distance fundamentally, but I think it's also structural in two ways. One, like I say, it's at a distance from people. It's people from senior levels of unions sitting in another structure where there's very little direct communication. And secondly, these are literally federations of unions organized on a country-by-country basis. And I think that's different. Okay, more people are joining. I'm happy to go over that again. I see there's one or two more people coming.
Yeah.
I'll just...
But let's see, perhaps it does come as a question from the participants too. We are just picking up on one key response that have been there to the question of, can one big union still be organized today, similar to the ICU? And we are trying to engage with that question. But we can come back to that. We also have somebody that with us, Peter, that has worked for a long time in the global union, so perhaps could also tell us something on that. But let's first open for questions or comments you may have.
Maybe I should just repeat the gist of that for the one or two people who joined later. Hi, there was a question about what is similar and different between the ICU and its model and the current kind of global union federation model. For those of you who are here a bit earlier, just bear with me. For those who've just joined, I think it's a few things. The first is those global union federations are quite far from the ordinary union member. I think this is tied to two structural issues. One, that the relationship is mediated through the upper levels of a given union. So there's no real engagement of ordinary members in that. And secondly, structurally, the GUFs, the global union federations, are usually sectorally based. But what they are really federations of sectoral unions organized on a national basis. So the South African Metal Workers Union will be there, the auto workers in the States will be there, the whatever will be. So it's slightly different. I mean, the idea of the ICU, one big union, and this is where I'll shift it a bit here and add something new, is that you would literally have one union that covers multiple countries. That was the idea. And secondly, the ICU was in practice a general union, so pretty much all workers were in there. So it was intended to be not based on specific sectors like, transport or metals. The third thing is the ICU's structure was quite complicated and very messy, but it wasn't necessarily as formally hierarchical as current union structures are and as relations with global union federations are. So I think in some ways it was relatively flatter. So people would have more of a sense. I should maybe just mention one other thing. The ICU in its press spoke a lot about what its union was doing in different countries. So there would be regular reports and letters and people reading out things at meetings. Oh, we got a message from Mr. Kodali in South Africa. This is what they're doing. You get people in, say, Namibia, there's a strike going to be in South Africa. How do we support it? So the stuff was much more in people's consciousness. And I think that was important in shaping how people thought about this international dimension.
Yeah, thanks, Lucian, also for the addition that you made. I don't know whether there is any immediate question, but if I can pick up on that, when you were discussing and trying to analyze what were some of the factors that actually undermined the political project of the ICU, you do mention weak structures. And like the communication, that well, there was some communication, but still. So in a way, those things are now. We have stronger structures in each country, much better communication. So what is that one key ingredient that made ICU so particular? Because if those very factors are the ones undermining, today we have those, we should have a different situation. Or what's your thinking of that?
Look, I think it's partly that the ICU, as I indicated in the lecture, it really struggled in a very basic way to translate its vision into reality. So a lot of ICU activities, the ICU actually operated in two worlds. There was the world of the ICU and its rhetoric and creating a sort of working class counter-public, very assertive, very angry, electrifying speeches. And the day-to-day, the ICU wasn't really very good at organizing strikes, organizing boycotts, organizing campaigns. A lot of its day-to-day activity was very, very limited. So I don't think it ever faced the sort of challenge of trying to pull off something going across a region. It wasn't capable of pulling off something going across a whole country. So I think it's partly there. It was an issue around the strategy that they didn't really have a way to translate these aspirations into a concrete program. But that is tied very much to the issue of structures. It was very loose. It was often quite chaotic. There were serious cases of corruption. And, there were elements of sort of demagoguery and leaders sort of, really building themselves up and that. So, yeah, I think that's part of it. And the other thing around the structure is, although they spread all over the place, they didn't really have a way of kind of connecting the sections. They were sort of, well, we disregard the borders and we organize everywhere, but they didn't really actually have some sort of international ICU council. It was sort of quite informal, an informal internationalism, if I may put it that way. I saw there was a hand. Was it
Nico, did you have your hand up at some point? Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, just because eventually someone else wants to say something. But I have a very particular, I mean, at the end, it's a very interesting debate, obviously, and what Lira just raised is very clear as a type of problem facing. But I want to go back to the challenges you mentioned at the end of the presentation, which deals to the issue of identities, which is extremely, extremely important because obviously transcending those borders in order to create class identity is still rooted in those identities, as you clearly mentioned. So I have two questions on the history of ICU. And it's at the beginning, you mentioned the countries of Southern Africa that were involved. And I was curious because you haven't, at the beginning, there wasn't a clear, or as far as I understand ICU, Mozambique was not part of that network, while Mozambican workers were there. So I wonder how that, I mean, that's I worked in Mozambique and South Africa for quite a long time, but I have rather the Mozambican perspective. And the question I have is, I mean, the question is quite simple. Why you think Mozambique was not part of that, and whether issues like language or identity or political background or history was part of it? Because my concern is that knowing some of Mozambican political history, I feel as if many Mozambicans would have felt interested for ICU because of the whole history of Mozambique. And I mean, the revolution in Mozambique is not just a coincidence. It is rooted in previous experiences of organization, and as you may know, and agree or not, it was at the beginning, it was a quite successful revolutionary process. It was something very much along the lines of a revolution from below. So the question is, why you think Mozambicans were not part, or Mozambique as such was not part of that network? Being the Mozambican immigrant workers in the mining sector so important, how you explain that? And I hope to be clear with the question because it deals with.
No, it's very clear, and the way you've prefaced it also makes it clear. I mean, one of the things in that quite compressed text I tried to raise is that, you know, the ICU was very much, it was trying to organize the sort of mobile, interconnected working class, but it also reflected in some ways the fractures in that class. You know, so whether it was between races or even between ethnic groups. And I think there, to the extent these things link to language, that is significant. If you look in Southern Africa, the connections between the territories that have been under Portugal, the Lusophone territories and the Anglophone territories, is a huge one. It's absolutely enormous. So even if you looked at that early period in the history of the left there, the connection between, say, socialists or syndicalists or nationalists in Mozambique would be much more likely to be with Angola or with Portugal itself. And the revolutionary tradition of Mozambique was profoundly shaped by the Portuguese radical tradition. So you see an early period, for example, of syndicalism and later of Marxism-Leninism. So that language is a huge thing, but I think it's also the issue of empire, because all these ones were under the British Empire, the things where the ICU was active. They were either directly under the British Empire, like South Africa, you know, Swaziland and so on, or they were ruled indirectly. So Southwest Africa, Namibia, was literally a colony of South Africa. So South Africa was there, but it had its own colony. So I think that language culture issues is a big thing, and it played off in different countries as well. So I was just reading a bit earlier, the ICU's Workers' Herald, which is a very successful newspaper. It's very interesting. It's almost completely, it's predominantly in English. And that would mean in some areas people would just say, well, I'm not going to read it. It doesn't have anything in my language. So there's also an issue around identity being linked to language, not just in terms of ethnicity or race, but also in terms of level of education. So someone like Clemens Gadali, I mean, you've got to just try to get your head around how charismatic he was. Because he was from Malawi, he could not speak any local Black languages in South Africa at all. Yet he could hold a rally in a countryside where nobody could understand the English he spoke, and people would be excited. He have translators. So he's incredibly charismatic. In fact, a lot of people thought he was an African American, you know, and he was there in his bow tie. And, you know, so yes, in a way, he's very charismatic, but in a way, he reflected that division. You know, he wasn't an ordinary worker. So I think they were sort of stuck with this. And I think your point is maybe raises a bigger thing. I mean, how do you navigate these identities? I think sometimes on the left and in the working class movement, people treat identities as unimportant, and they don't really know how to deal with it. And I think a lot of this sort of quite crude identity politics you see in the West these days, it's an attempt to grapple with difference, but I don't think it's a very good one in my own view. But you don't want to go on the other side to, oh, we're all workers, nothing matters, and that. The last thing I should just mention is, I think in Latin America or the Caribbean, the difference is most countries have one language. And this is not the case in the African context. English or Portuguese or French, maybe a lingua franca or Arabic, but it's not the primary language for most people. So even in South Africa, we have 12 official languages. Yes, all government business is done in English, but it's very different to Portuguese, where or say Brazil, where black, white, mestizo, whatever, all speak Portuguese. So it's quite a big issue. So there's an added complexity. Yeah. I saw a hand. Was it Bill?
I think it was Bill. Bill, did you want to say something? Yes, please, but unmute yourself, please, because we can't hear you.
Okay. My question was building on that idea of identity, and I was just wondering, is the nation state as a concept an inhibitor to cross-national organizing for the working class? Because it's so deeply rooted in our identities that most of us here even would introduce ourselves as Ale from Argentina, who from Germany. And I ask that because to achieve what you are referring to as leveling up, it's unfortunate, or it's even arguable, that a lot of the working class in developed countries, is the quality of life is sustained and subsidized by a lot of exploitation by the working class of other places. So is it possible for these two groups of people then to have similar interests and work together? And if so, what would be the way we would go about it from where we are now, not in an idealistic future?
Look, I think there's two slightly separate questions there. The one is the issue of the nation state, and I'll take that first. Then I'll take the question about whether there's a antagonistic set of interests between working classes in different countries, where I think I'll probably disagree with you on that a bit. But let me just deal with the nation state. So let's take, are you from Kenya? Just looking. Yeah, okay. So, and similarly with South Africa, the states in which we live were once created by Britain, right? And at independence, many, or in the case of Southern Africa, specifically Namibia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, governments decided at the end of white rule, we should just create one nation, because the divisions, we don't want to start redrawing the boundaries. It's going to be a huge mess. We don't want to amplify ethnic and racial divisions. So although people are lumped together in countries, states have actively promoted those identities, and many people have embraced those identities as preferable to what you might have otherwise. If you look at South Africa and the World Cup, the thing of South Africa winning the Rugby World Cup is a big thing in South Africa. It's like a really huge thing, where people live in this sort of, it's not an imagined community, because you are under that state, you have a sense of a certain history, but you also go through that state's bureaucracy, its education systems, its cultural and communication systems. So it's not simply an imagined community like Benedict Anderson had. I don't think it's true. Now, this is where one of the obstacles comes in, which is that people have these very strong identities. And it can, as I said in my input, it makes sense to a lot of people to say, look, I am this is my government owes me this. And it is literally, as you just saw in America now, it is literally easier to put pressure on your government to say, look, you take care of us first. You take care of us first. It is easier in many cases. Whether that's good or bad, or whether it backfires is a different discussion. But for a lot of people, that's easier to imagine than the idea that you may have a general strike across 5 countries. The second thing is that different states have got different conditions. So different legal systems, I'm not talking here about different histories, but different legal systems, different balances of forces between classes, different levels of industrialization. So it's what is the common issue that people have? South Africa has a lot of migrants from Zimbabwe, millions. And many South Africans resent this. And they say, well, these Zimbabweans will work more cheaply. But what is cheap for a South African may actually be, compared to many Zimbabweans who are coming from a collapsed economy, be actually not cheap. It might be quite a good wage. So that's just a way of illustrating the experience might be different. If you're in Zimbabwe, where 4,000 industries closed down over the last 15 years, you come to South Africa, compared to being unemployed or street trading in Zimbabwe, it's better to work as a low-wage worker on an apple farm. But the South African will resent you because you might work cheaper and you're desperate for that job. So I'm not making a judgment about people working cheaper, but it's literally people are coming from different contexts. The related problem here is, who do you bargain with? And this is something maybe the global union federations are actually good at, that they can sometimes target a multinational and say, we will organize in that multinational internationally, or try to have some sort of global framework agreement with the multinational company. That's our bargaining partner. But if you're doing 5 countries, 6 countries, 7 countries in Southern Africa, who do you bargain with? Where do you take the manifesto? There is no, it's even today, we're in the United Nations. If there was a global general strike, who would you negotiate with? So look, let's get on to the issue of whether workers have antagonistic interests, which you raised. It's a tricky one, Bill, and I don't want to give a simple answer, but I think it's complicated because workers in different countries have got shared as well as conflicting interests. I mean, if we literally had to say workers in richer countries are doing better because of the state of workers in poorer countries, I mean, we would logically be driven to the conclusion that, for example, Black workers in South Africa are better off and they have higher wages than Black workers in, say, Zimbabwe, because of something their economy is doing to lift them up at the expense of the Zimbabweans. Does that make sense? It's easy to look and we say, well, there's a Western country and it's benefiting this way from it. But when we start to look at the divisions in the global South, couldn't somebody make the same argument? Average wage in Kenya is better than average wage in Somalia, and therefore the Kenyans are somehow doing us dirty. On the other side, isn't it also a threat to workers in better paid countries, the fact that other workers are treated badly? So let's take it with South Africa. If we had to say the South Africans benefit from the lack of development, the industrial collapse of Zimbabwe, then the problem would be that many South African workers don't benefit because they're competing with those workers for jobs. Does this make sense? So for me, this issue, there needs a long discussion, but my overall view is, I think the difference in wages in different countries is not the result of some sort of worker-to-worker exploitation. I think it reflects different levels of industrial development, and we could get on to the economics of that, and the differential strength of labor movements in different countries. That would be my own take on it. I think we lost Bill along the way, did we?
Yeah, he went.
There he is. He's taken the
back.
camera. That's a whole longer discussion, but that actually came up in the ICU because many South Africans were saying, well, these freaking foreigners are stealing our jobs, the Indians are doing it, and so on. So, yeah, I think we just need to be clear on how we understand that. But I think if we proceed from the assumption that workers in one country are the enemies of work in another country, I think the project of trying to organize international solidarity will fall, because why would anyone want to do this? What's in it for them? They'd be better to vote Trump, frankly. Okay, I've noticed Nicola, and I noticed, was it Femi?
Femi, please go. I just raised my hand because there was space.
Femi, do you want to go? Yes, please. You're still muted. No, you're still muted. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much. Based on this international solidarity, I want to ask, is there any other way for the Global Labor Union to intervene in the countries, most especially in the Africas, where we are having a challenge of union leaders? Maybe I'm thought we have a weak leadership in unionism, or we have a weak union body that couldn't take up the challenges of the entire work. Because if you are especially like for a Nigeria, for an example now, if we look at it, the only focus of the union that we have these days is just about the salary. The general welfare of the population is no more part of the agenda, the way I look into it. Because even when anything is wrong, but once the salary, maybe the salary of any membership of the union, whether the mother union or affiliated union, maybe like NASU, ASU, if anything that has to do with them is being affected, they declare strike with immediate effect, without considering the populace feeling or emotion. So far, it's affected, they don't care. But if it has to do with something affecting the general populace, nobody bothered. So far, their own interest is being satisfied. So I want to ask, there anything that a global labor union or through the convention that can be done to be intervened in a nation that is being affected in this way? Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much. Let me also take Nicholas, and then I will deal with those together. Maybe there's ways I can link them. And yeah.
No, just a brief comment, because going back to Lyra's point, whether or your question on whether one big union is feasible today, I would like to point out that ICU was a regional union, and that range explains a lot. Because my question was actually oriented on somehow on how Latin America as a region deals with global unions, and whether the language and somehow the culture also is a limit, because in my understanding is a limit, and explains why this hierarchy is becomes so bureaucratic. I mean, the representatives of global unions and coming from Latin America, they have certain skills, and obviously those are class skills, educational skills, political context, etc. So my question was, I mean, the point is still valid, and whether we need in order to think global unions and internationalism, I think we need to focus on the intermediate level of articulation. And this is maybe something to be developed or explored later on. Sorry to go back to that.
No, but I think those two questions fit together quite well, because if I'm capturing what both of you have said, I mean, partly the issue is the union leaders themselves, whether they have that vision and that ability, whether they are trapped in thinking about their own security as a union leader, as a job, as a permanent career. And at the same time, whether, given that these bureaucracies and that exist, often based on skills and time and availability and education, and that, is there a way we can build capacity in unions, maybe beyond them, and imagination in unions beyond that? Because I don't think we're in a situation now where some sort of, I think union reforms are necessary, but it's a long road. So I think this idea about intermediate, building the other layers in the union, and maybe thinking more about, even as a smaller step, direct worker-to-worker contacts, shop steward to shop steward, based in particular corporations, for example. I don't always want to harp on about South African examples, but one of the things the metal union in South Africa in Volkswagen used to do, because we have huge Volkswagen car plants here, was have a structure where they were linked up with shop stewards in Volkswagen in Germany and shop stewards in Volkswagen in the United States, and actually have exchanges of militants. So you would get a black South African worker from a car factory here actually organizing workers in the United States and being involved. So I think that's one way to build capacity. Again, these are huge questions, and I don't know enough about how a lot of the GUFs work to know whether these things are possible. But some sort of direct worker-to-worker thing, once these things get mediated through a very centralized bureaucracy, the scope for things to be warped, controlled, information flows managed, and so on is enormous. And that can mean a lot of resources as well. And look, we're also in the days now that unions are weaker in many countries, where the impact of donor funding, and that can often include wealthy philanthropists and so on, is immense. So there's a lot of risks that come with that as well. Okay, I've noted Jokanaya Mawopa.
Yeah, Jokanaya, can you hear us? You can go ahead. We can't hear you. If you're talking, there's no sound coming from your end. Would you like to put your question? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I think as the presenter have correctly put it, the issue of ICU, in my view, was mostly affected by the level of development within the countries that the ICU was also trying to cover. I think with the level of the union development by that time, it was too much for them to try and cover a number of countries where the level of national trade unionism was also low. Then to start at that level, I think it have a very big impact in terms of their operations. Then probably that also needs me to ask is at what level should we start talking of building international unions? Is it visible or is it practicable to start at regional? Then
Yeah. Okay, are you done, Jock and I? Okay. I've noted Alejandra. Let me take that as well. I think there's some very important points
Yes,
here.
because it's related. You mentioned in the video lecture that the ICU was centered in Black African and colored workers, but open to all. And it got my attention because I find it hard to make a union centered in one group, but open to everyone as a presentation and that everyone wants to join. And I think that's one of the problems, that we have to build regional or even global federations or unions. How can we make a representation of everyone based on one group? I know it's hard to reply to that, but some ideas regarding that, on how they did it and how it worked.
Yeah, so sure. So look, I mean, the one point that Nicholas raised that I didn't address, but I think it's important, is that regional character of the ICU. So it wasn't fully international, right? It was in a region where part of what made that link was that there was a lot of migration between countries. There were a whole lot of networks of people moving, and that included black workers coming in and out of South Africa, South Africans going in and out of other countries, white workers moving around, and so on. So I really think that's an important point. The regional range is important. But that goes to the point that was made, I think, by Jock and I, that the countries were also very different. I mean, some of those countries were really labor suppliers to the bigger economies. Eswatini or Swaziland and Lesotho or Basutoland. I mean, there's not much. They have a displaced proletariat. A huge amount of the working class is outside the country. It's like the old Algerian working class was all in France, so it made it possible to organize people, but it complicated organizing them. They will come back from ICU in South Africa, go to a village in Lesotho where they are an ICU member, but their employer is in another country. So I think that's very difficult. Okay, so the question I think that came out of that is, what would be the ways you could build some sort of international links? And I think there, the ICU is maybe an example of what doesn't work. I think it's maybe good to look at what the ICU failed to do. I mean, the one thing is, I think the ICU didn't. It had an aspiration to organize across the region. In fact, sometimes even said we're going to head up all the way to Egypt. It had the aspiration. It had some success, but it didn't really have a plan on how to do this. Now, without forming some sort of huge global coordinating council, you can think of more modest things like some sort of information sharing. See, Wisdom is having issues there with his connection. Some sort of information sharing, some sort of exchanges. I think these would be some basic steps without necessarily putting your bags in what is the huge big campaign we can do. At least start to make connections. Now, the problem there with Alejandro's point is the thing that came up earlier. And I'm sure Bill will also note this in context of, say, Kenya, is when you have very divided working classes, working class movements often reflect those divisions and reinforce them. Now, Latin America may be a bit different, but certainly in Southern Africa, Black workers, white workers, colored workers, Indian workers would tend to be in different unions. And this was partly because they had different legal statuses, partly a whole range of issues around race and power and so on. So how would you organize that? I think the ICU shows that you can aspire to something and not be very good at it. And very often ICU people really, really try to overcome the gaps, like when the ICU tried to hook up with the white trade unions, of the mainly white trade unions. But a lot of the white trade unions weren't interested in hooking up with the ICU, and a lot of people in the ICU weren't that interested in hooking up with white workers. So I don't know how you solve it. I mean, because the Black African working class is the biggest component, 70, 80% in many of these countries at that time, you can get quite far just in that group. But it's not the same as organizing the whole working class. And given you would have a very, often quite a racialized division of labor, it would mean often you would not have many of the skilled workers on your side, many white collar workers on your side, and so on, which would make things like a general strike difficult. And the idea of taking over production, if you don't have a broad range of occupations, is also going to be difficult. The last thing I should just say, I mean, in the South African context as well, and Southern Africa, what you often get is a fusion of race and class identities. So somebody once said to me, if somebody used the term the worker, the image, the worker in South Africa in the 1920s, you'd probably be thinking of a white worker who works in a factory or a mine with a moustache and the respectable look of the time with the tie. And if you say worker now, people assume a Black African man. So those things are fused a bit, and that also complicates things because it allows people to kind of use class, but also close down class issues by saying, well, we're all oppressed. I mean, American identity politics, just looking at the recent news, is full of this, where anyone can be a man of the people, because they emphasize a particular identity. Kamala Harris, I'm middle class. Okay, you may have been once, but assert a class identity, but you overcode that by bringing in other identities like race or gender. And that's very much the thing there. Okay, Bill.
I think
I don't know if I answered your questions earlier properly. So, yeah.
Yes, you did. And sorry, my laptop died, so I had to switch over to my phone.
No,
I lost maybe
totally understand.
Yeah, but I have another question. I think if someone else hasn't asked, can go, but I have another question.
Please, can I speak?
Okay, let's take you, and then I see a message. Are you Adi Ibrahim?
Yeah, and then
he can't raise. Says
Yes.
Cannot raise hand. So let's take. Are you? I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. Are you Adi?
Yes, yes, you're right. How you are there, Ibrahim? See, I was trying to raise my hand since, but it's like my system is not giving me the correct answer. I just want to come in with something that is very, very important for us on my own area of organizing. And you raise a vital point that is one of the challenges I have when I went to the South Africa to organize the Uber driver and what I've done. It's not organized per se, to bring all the factions of association together so that we can speak as a one voice to ask for our rights from all these app owners. But the challenges you raise, issue of race, those guys, they came from another country. There's a big problem there. because they are majority of people doing Uber work in South Africa, and the South African indigenes are not much, and the South Africa indigene want to be a precedent of a unified union that we are trying to put together. But when you go by elections, they will not be able, to attain that particular position. So they have been helping with the Department of Transportation in South Africa because they are indigenes. And this one caused a lot of problem. Recently, we're hearing of killing Uber driver and what have you. Although there is a lot of politicking around it, the normal transport system of olden days, traditional transport of olden days, they have a problem with them. The indigenous, they have a problem with the other African country. So I happen to have a meeting with about 7 of different associations, because that other country that they came, they have separate associations. And I asked a questions in that particular meeting, that all of us are black here. There is no white person among us. Every one of us come from different country, but we are black. Can we still call it a racism among ourselves? Or can we kill ourselves because of someone that want to lead? And do we see ourselves as a brother? And I suggest that, look, it's very easy for us to settle this problem. What happened is that let's have a central body. And in that central body, each associations that, separately should bring two representatives, chairman, secretary, and let them put everybody into the central body. And let us work together and see how the leadership will figure out among us. There's a lot of issues there, but what I'm not happy with is that how can a black killing black? How can a black calling his fellow black a foreigner because he migrates from whether Zimbabwe, whether Nigeria, whether whatever country, as long as in Africa? So that is what it gives me some kind of where are we heading to as an Africa? Because the project I'm trying to pull now is to bring all Africa together on the one platform. That's Africa Platform Workers Representatives. So that all of us, we're about 70 countries now in Africa that we put together there. So my question is that if really we want to talk about how do we get liberations, even with the government, even with the capitalists and what have you, we need to come together as an entity first and love ourselves in solidarity. If that one is not happened, even the wages and what have you can only, have a good wages in environment if everybody speak one voice. That is one aspect. The second aspect that I happen to still notice, and they told me, is people migrate to their country illegally. And how do those people, and what caused people to move from their country is because of the economics of their country that push them out to look for an environment that they can be able to, feed their family. On that kind of situation, that kind of particular person cannot really stand up for his right. And I will tell you why. When we are trying to do something in South Africa, we have all these funerals that all these people that come from other countries to come up with their complaint so that we can put it in the face. What they told us that they cannot come physically because they are not supposed to be working in South Africa. They are just coming illegally, and if they show their face, automatically they will move them back to their country. So my question is this: how can a global solidarity help those kind of people? Because I cannot just leave my country if I'm living fine in my country, if everything is okay in my country, if my economy is okay in my country, or if I want to even migrate to another country, that means I will go with a prayer, with my own money that will help me to stand that kind of area.
Look, exactly. Look, I'm going to deal with it. Bill, do you want to come in there? Is it a similar issue, or can I deal with this one here?
Bill?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello.
Is your question a similar one, or can I just deal with this one? Because I think this is quite a big one. Okay. Look, I mean, this is the challenge of unions, right? This is the whole point: is how do we find ways of finding common interests so that people can organize together and find ways of building some sort of solidarity and identity across those divisions. Because as you point out in South Africa, look, I mean, well, racial solidarity is not going to be enough for most South Africans because South Africa, generally speaking, is an immigrant receiving country. And there's a lot of tension around that, as you've experienced. So the challenge becomes, how do you get people to unite despite those differences? And the first thing has to be, I think, showing that people will benefit from that unity. Because the thing is, workers can benefit by pushing other people outside of labor markets. That's what a lot of South African workers want to do. They want foreign workers out. So the thinking is, look, South Africa's got millions unemployed. If we kick all the immigrants out, those are millions of jobs available. So how do you convince people? And the first thing would be, I think it has to be shown that there is something to be gained by class-based solidarity. It goes to the point, I don't know if I put it as well as I'd like, but with Bill, that the interests of the working class are kind of complicated because workers can benefit in some ways from closing labor markets, restricting entry, special deals. And this can even be within one country, skilled workers controlling particular occupations and so on. But they also lose out from that. They also lose out from that. And how do you win that benefit? I think the argument that would work with some South Africans is exactly that. Look, you're worried about, this goes to leveling up, you're worried about immigrants working cheaper. Well, why don't you just make sure that the immigrants are on the same union as you and you all get the same rate, the rate for the job? That's a straightforward thing, like we make sure we control the supply of labor as unions, and then we enforce a single rate. We don't care who you are, black, brown, pink, white, Nigerian, South African, Kenyan, Zimbabwe, don't care, colored, African, whatever, we don't care. So you have to win people with that. And I think very often, because unions are weak, people are not always convinced. They're not always convinced. And it goes to the nation state as well, because the nation state is more likely, not always, is more likely to be sympathetic, at least more under pressure from its own nationals. I mean, look, I hear you, Mr. Ibrahim, about the South African thing, and I'm sure you didn't have a great time, but it's like a serious issue. How do you show people, although they can benefit from being exclusive, that they can benefit much more from solidarity, that they can benefit much more from coming together? All right.
In that,
Hello.
Yeah,
Hello.
sorry, Idli.
Hello.
I see you said Bull on the.
okay.
Hello, Elvis on the speak.
Hi, Elvis.
Okay.
Fire away.
Yeah, first, good evening, everyone. I like to, mine is a kind of, I want to correct an impression and I want to add to the subject matter. First, the impression I want to correct is about what Femi earlier said, that the union in Nigeria is only concerned about wages. I want to disagree with him on that, because the Nigeria Labour Congress in Nigeria, ably led by Comrade Joe Ajero, the president of Nigeria Labour Congress, even when the president of Nigeria decided to remove fuel subsidy, it was the Labour Center. And this is what affected the populace in Nigeria. The Labour Center swing into action. And even when there was increase in electricity tariff, the Labour Center swing into action. This has nothing to do with wages of workers. These are issues that affected the entire populace of Nigeria. And I want to say this, that even the Labour Center, the ILO, had to intervene at a point when the president was being harassed and intimidated. That is one. Then the second one I want to talk about is about this Uber that my brother Ayoade, I believe, is the general secretary of that union. Labor movement is an organized movement, and there's cohesion in the labor movement, and the labor movement all around the world is one. We don't believe in illegality. If you migrate to a country illegally, that you don't have the backing of the labor movement, because the labor movement does not support any illegal thing. For you to go to, if you want to migrate to another country, if you migrate legally, then you should enjoy what the national of that country, whatever the union there, you should be able to come out as somebody who migrated legally. You should be able to benefit, because then you will be received, you enjoy the benefit of that same country. Then talking about Uber people coming together, and this is the problem we have in Africa. You said because majority are from Nigeria, you don't see a South African becoming a president. That is a wrong impression. If the South African man is well experienced in the Uber business, and you as a Nigerian, you don't have what it takes, why don't you allow the South African man to become the president and you learn from him? But most Africans, because we believe we are in the majority, we want to say because we are in the majority, then we should overshadow the person that has the wherewithal to make the union survive. But this issue of tribalism, ethnicity, that is what is killing the labor movement. Because when a man, because you are in the majority and you know that the man that is not in the majority has what it takes to survive the union, to lead, you deny him that opportunity because you are in the majority. This is part of what is killing the union. Then, regarding to what Remy said earlier on too, when you see labor leaders fighting for the majority, even though we have our scope, as labor leaders, we are supposed to first protect our workers. And that is why we preach, we want to organize. When we go to organize, I believe it's people like Femi, that when we go to organize, they don't want to be part of the union.
I'm sorry,
they don't want to be part of the...
We are
Excuse me, please. Let me just land. I'm sorry, let me land. You see, when we go organizing, certain persons, when you go to tell them that these are the benefits, it is more, there's an injury to one. Excuse
me, comrade, do you have a question?
Belong to the union. When you belong to the labor, it's more from it. But when you go to them, these are labor leaders are saying that labor leaders are going to collect bribe. How do the labor survive in such a country when you have people like this?
I'm going to mute you, because if you have a question, please do. This is not about convincing each other of what union is doing or not doing.
No, but I have to correct an impression because we're talking globally now.
That's okay. Yes, but do you have a question for Lucien? Do you have a question for in the topic that we are discussing?
Yeah, the question I have. Yes. Now back to my question. Yes. What is the solution to the challenges of globalization, industrial and commercial workers in Africa?
Okay. Thank you very much.
Look, if I can pick up on that and the earlier point, and there's also a comment made, I think it was Nucha Lubuche. One of the things here, and this is where we have to think carefully about identities. This issue of identities keeps coming up. I mean, one thing would be to think about the composition of leadership, which I think both Elvis and Ayoade are raising. But what Naucha is saying, you maybe think about having some sort of neutral body, some sort of structure that can facilitate group work and unity. And there may be different ways to do this. So, for example, given that identities are a reality, it may be important, certainly in South African politics, often has been to make sure that different groups in that union see themselves as represented in the leadership. Now, I'm not a fan of sort of, set seats and that sort of thing, but I do think it helps people have some buy-in. So I think both of them, both comrades have made that point a bit, that we need solidarity, but the other side, we have to deal with the fact that there are these divisions, and how do we manage them? And I think it needs a lot of thought. I think artificially doing it, I don't think it's going to help. This goes to a point that Ronald has also raised. He's saying, look, we need to also be careful about terms like illegal immigrant or undocumented and so on. And I think that's true. However, I think we also do need to be aware of where people using that term comes from. Because the argument is literally, well, I live here, I've done everything legally, or why can somebody come over the border? And this is how your average South African worker will argue. Why can somebody who come over from the border get free hospital treatment in South Africa? So I'm not saying that, Ronald, that you're wrong, but I think we also have to be sensitive where people are coming from on the other side and try to find a way to win people. That's what I'm getting at. So I agree. Some words are not going to help us win people. Some demands are not going to help us win people. But how do you get people to stand together? Because ultimately, it's ordinary people that are in conflict with each other, but are also in conflict with ruling classes. How do we make sure that ordinary people can find each other in ways that allow them to resist the powerful who put them in these situations? I think Ayuyadi's raised that, and I think Ronald's raised that, people often are immigrating because of their terrible situations. Okay. So it's not their fault, but it becomes an issue when people now are competing for jobs and there's a shrinking pie. So how do you find a win-win for people without saying, well, those guys are all wrong or those guys are all wrong? How do you find something in common? And this is where leveling up came in. I want to link this to somebody who wrote about this in the contemporary era, which was Kim Moody, who wrote a book called Workers in a Lean World. He argued there that ultimately, now whether we can get it done is what we're all discussing, but he said ultimately, look, the solution to industries all moving to Asia is actually a global minimum wage and a globalization of basic working conditions. And I think that can be something, an alternative to protectionism. The difficulty again, and I'm not going to give people say there's a simple answer. The difficulty is for a lot of people, it seems easier, and it often is easier to try get a solution in like build the wall, that sort of solution. That it does seem easier to people. So you've got to show people this other thing is feasible and desirable. Now, the problem with the ICU is it made the argument that this is feasible. It made the argument that this is desirable. But because of its weak structures, its limited strategy, its inability to translate the vision into a concrete daily program on all fronts, it wasn't able to win people in the long run. So people in the ICU, they were very excited. And you see this pattern getting it. People are like blown away by the ICU. Like, this is incredible stuff. But after 2-3 years of hearing ICU speakers saying, oh, we're going to reform land, we're going to do this, we're going to break this law, we're going to do that, people are just like, okay, fine. You do that. I've heard enough. I'm not paying you anymore. I don't know where my money has gone on subs. I don't know why I waste my time in meetings. I'm done. I'm gone. If you can't translate the vision into something practical that people benefit from, and step by step build and accumulate power, unity, and consciousness, you're not going to get anywhere. And this is my frustration often, with a lot of circles on the left, is people have got great manifestos, but it's completely irrelevant to most people. Somebody say we should have the following 30 transitional demands. So what? So what? I can also, there are a lot of things I want. So what? And if somebody comes along and says, well, look, tomorrow I will close the border and I'll expel the foreigners. What's your answer? They're a bad person. Okay, fine. But you're not winning people there. I want to just mention one last thing on this thing. Maybe if you think about it, in some ways the ICU had elements of what we would call national populism. I mean, it coexisted in this mix of the ICU. You did have parts of the ICU saying close the borders, the others say organize across borders. Now, the point I want to make here is no union can be ideologically homogenous. You can't have a union where absolutely everyone agrees on everything, because people don't join a union because of ideology. People join a union because they have some sense of a common interest. So the issue is how you manage that. Workers are going to have different views, different experiences. If your union grows, you are going to have different identities in the union. You've got to find a way to deal with that. Just shutting down discussions is not going to work. Hectoring people like this is right, this is wrong, and that's not going to work. Shaming people, that stuff's not going to work. What is going to be important is some sort of education process that people engage, where they can develop critical thinking. And this would be my criticism of a lot of union education these days. It's either incredibly technical. How do you use the labor law to do this and that? How do you write a contract? How do you administer membership numbers? Or it's incredibly abstract. Well, socialism is the future. Build it now. Fantastic. But those two things are not linked. There's this huge gap in the middle where things like this course are so important, where people can look at different experiences, think about them, realize there isn't a simple answer. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we can learn from the past. Some of what the ICU did was amazing, and it's hidden because we think in terms of nation states. So in South Africa, the ICU is written as chapter in the story of the labor movement, not understood as regional. The exact same thing is true of the ICU in Zimbabwe. It's a chapter in the national liberation struggle. It's very hard for us to think of something this radical, and I think we should appreciate the radicalism of the ICU, however complicated, however contradictory it was. But thinking about organizing across borders, think about workers trying to control labor markets, thinking about some sort of solidarity across incredibly deep and powerful divisions. And just this aspiration as well. And I raised this in the democracy section, thinking about democracy above and beyond simply elections. In fact, the ICU almost never speaks about elections. Thinking about this thing of extending workers' control of production. And again, it's no good just having random slogans. We should take over the factories. How do you build to there if that's where you want to go? But above all, to look at options, to evaluate them, and to think, what do you do on Monday? What does all this stuff mean on Monday? Because we can all come out of here singing the red flag or whatever. It's not really going to help. And I think this is what national populists show, that a lot of the left is losing the argument because it doesn't have anything to offer a lot of people. Whether better messaging will do it, but I think until unions are back to basics, dealing with some basic issues, we're going to be stuck spinning here. And we don't, in looking at the past, also have to beat a dead horse. We don't have to pretend everything was fine. We can just do this. We can be like a history society and just relive the past. We're in a different world now. So that's where I kind of leave it. I hope I brought those things together. I know Bill had some other points, but I think we may be out of time.
Yeah, but there is a comment, a long one. I leave it a moment for you to read it if you want to respond. But thanks so much, Lucien. Very, very interesting. For sure, we will never end these discussions. I would like to pick up on what Nico said, that just by speaking of virtues of solidarity, we can't just convince people with that. You really need that kind of education. And I guess we are in the same line of really engaging in this political education to expose those power relations that are there, often hidden, even in the form of workers here in the West actually having suppressed wages exactly because they can rely on lots of services offered for cheap prices by the migrants, but also lots of cheap products produced in other countries. So there is a relation there, and between suppression of wages in the North and very low wages in the South, where workers are pitted against each other, but in fact is the capital that is benefiting out of that. And that sort of power relations that we aim with our model of education and with all the work we do to expose, and it's a conversation we should continue having it. But thanks very much, everyone, for joining. Really, really thanks a lot. Lucien, I know Peter wants to talk.
It's a pleasure. Like I say, don't have any sacred cows. Everything should be discussed. And yeah, that's the only way we're going to get out of where we're at. I just want to remind everybody, unions are still probably the biggest organizations in civil society outside of religious groups. So they're still there. But as Lira said at the beginning, where we are and what we do is it's not what we could be. Not what we could be.
Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank
and
you,
see you tomorrow
everybody.
for the next workshop. Bye.